An Old Orchard Beach police officer is in ICE custody tonight. John Luke Evans of Jamaica was arrested on Friday.
Evans was a reserve police officer with the department. We're just hearing from the police chief, who says Officer Evans actually cleared to work in May by Homeland Security.
And as tempting as it is to see this as a haha, the Empire did something stupid incident, this is so much more than just an interesting mishap or a systems error within this colossal American Death Star. It signifies something much deeper and more fundamental about the state of the US Imperial Core and implications for the rest of the world. So what happened basically was that John here was working as a police officer in the town of Old Orchard Beach in the US state of Maine on a visa which apparently had expired. Now, the US Department of Homeland Security has something called the E-Verify system that is supposed to catch such things and flag them whenever a prospective employer runs a prospective employee's details through the database. And apparently what happened here is that the Old Orchard Beach Police Department did exactly that when they hired John, and the results came back fine. So he started working and everything was okay until he tried to buy a private firearm, and then his details were sent through the ICE database, and it emerged that he was in fact in the country illegally, and then he got arrested by ICE. Bear in mind that ICE is also part of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, as you can imagine, the Old Orchard Beach Police Department was absolutely mortified, and they quickly made it clear they had done their due diligence before hiring John. So the blame for this lay with the Department of Homeland Security, not with them. The Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, Tricia McLaughlin, angrily shot back, accusing the town of reckless reliance on the DHS E-Verify program. Think about the implications of that. Two entities under the same government department apparently have two separate databases doing basically the same thing, verifying whether people have the right to work in the country or not. Now, the database that employers are mandated by law to work with cleared this person to work, while the other database, which employers are not legally obligated to work with, apparently was the one with the more up-to-date information. And when this discrepancy was flagged, the official government response was that an employer relied recklessly on the official government tool that was expressly meant to be relied upon. What you're seeing here is a live action demonstration of what happens to an empire when it gets too big and begins crumbling under its own weight. It's called the Goldilocks principle, and it's named after the fairy tale where Goldilocks doesn't like the porridge that is too hot or too cold, or the bed that is too big or too small. She prefers the ones that are just right, somewhere in the middle. The same principle applies to states and empires, where if a state has too little capacity, it's generally not a very nice place to live in because it has no power to do the things that make people's lives better, such as build infrastructure and invest in social amenities and industry. On the other hand, when it becomes too powerful and sprawls into a late-stage empire, it loses the capacity to self-regulate and becomes a monster running on autopilot. In a late-stage empire, there's no straightforward or consistent process for getting anything done. Take immigration, for example. How do you become a US citizen? Short answer, nobody really knows. Almost anywhere else, there are straightforward, easy to understand guidelines and principles guiding the citizenship process. Now, in the US, there is no naturalization process. Every case is treated like a criminal investigation rather than a simple function of state. There's no time frame for case resolution. It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to push a single successful naturalization petition. And in the years or even decades that it takes to complete this snail-paced process, people often find themselves in legal and bureaucratic limbo, often unable to work or travel, for example. Now, according to the Goldilocks principle, the perfect midpoint is where the state has the perfect balance of simple, straightforward, and cheap internal processes on the one hand, and the benefits of imperial power on the other hand. In the US, this was probably reached sometime between the 2 or 3 decades after the end of World War II. What has followed since then has been the unavoidable journey to the right side of this graph, where it has gotten too big, too powerful, and too imprisoned by its own inertia to change course. Where there was once an immigration and naturalization service, there now needed to be a new behemoth called the Department of Homeland Security, which has the E-Verify program on one hand and a separate ICE database on the other hand, basically splitting a task performed by one agency into two. 22 years and several $1 billion later, it turns out that an illegal immigrant can get a job in law enforcement handling firearms without the multi-billion-dollar multi-agency system catching it. And when it is eventually flagged, the blame is not placed on the system for being obviously substandard, but on its users for not jumping through extra voluntary hoops. You can think of the late-stage empire's Goldilocks paradox as these temporary airport security lanes. The only reason that these snaking, circuitous lanes exist is that thousands of people need to be cleared. If the size of the traffic being handled was smaller, there will be fewer lanes and they will be much shorter. Remember, the goal is actually to move from A to B. The reason why you have to go through A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, A8, A9, A10, and so on before you get to B is simply because there are too many people who need to be accommodated, not because the distance is actually that long. The bigger the system, the bigger the number of meaningless hoops that must be created for people to jump through. So here's a question. Does the current state of the empire resemble the sweet spot at the middle of this graph? Or is it more like this?